Cloud. So hello, I'm Elaine Trahan at Stanford University, and I am talking to archivists and librarians from all over the world to find out about what they do and their thoughts on the profession. And today I'm absolutely delighted to be able to talk to Dominique Luster, who is from Louisville, Kentucky, but now lives in Pittsburgh, where she is the first endowed archivist of the Charles Teenie Harris archives at the Carnegie Museum of Art. She was an undergrad at the University of Kentucky and did theatre design and technology, but also history and history of art and a variety of different kind of aspects of theatre design and technology. And she was a Fulbright scholar to Freie Universität in Berlin. She did an archives focused, I think, MLIS at Pittsburgh. And Dominique, you've also worked as a collections processor at the Smithsonian, and you've had a variety of different kinds of experiences in archives and libraries. So really, a rich and broad experience already. And one of the things that I really want to emphasize is to anybody who's watching this is to go and watch Dominique's TED Talk, which is really exceptional. I wouldn't say performance, that's the wrong word. An exceptional introduction to what it means to be an archivist and to have the stewardship, which is one of Dominique's words, stewardship of collections that are really meaningful for the community. So, Dominique, hello, good morning.
Hello.
Hi.
What a lovely introduction. I was like, oh yes, oh my goodness, it's so nice.
Well, I mean, it's really, I've done some reading on your background, and it really, I suppose, one of the questions that I will ask is how you became an archives library scholar, but it's clear to me that this must be like a joy in your life, and we'll come to that. But what is not a joy in our lives? Well, I mean, it is or isn't a joy in our lives. Is we're in the middle of this global pandemic. We're now in month 5, or 4 or 5, depending on where you are, of this lockdown. And given that we work in archives and libraries with textual objects, primary sources, how have you been coping with the lockdown? How has it made you think about your work?
It's been interesting, actually. I was one of those very few, very fortunate individuals for whom, one, I was actually out of town on vacation. So here in the US, I would say it was maybe the second week of March, first or second week of March, when things started happening very, very quickly. And I was in Kentucky with family that week, like let's say Monday through Friday, let's say. And on Wednesday, the museum started sending out communications of like, okay, we're gonna see what's happening. We're gonna see what's happening. And by Friday, they were like, everyone go home. And I was still in Kentucky when this happened. And so I actually left the museum to go on vacation to be with family and had absolutely no intention that I wouldn't be coming back. And so I was not prepared. I did not have any things. I did not have any plan. I was like at a family dinner 6 hours away, and the museum is saying, well, you're not coming back into your office. So I did not have any files with me. I did not have any materials with me. I didn't even have my like little office planner and like notebook. I had nothing. It was rough for a couple of days. I'll admit. I think that's putting it lightly. It was a little stressful.
Yes, I can imagine.
But thankfully, once things calmed down a little bit, I was able to go into the museum like fully PPE'd to the nines, like fully covered. I was escorted into the museum so that I could pack up a few things. I mean, we do work with textual items, and I have to have something. And I'm very fortunate that the Teenie Harris collection has actually been about 75% digitized and itemized.
Right.
So the collection is about 80,000 photographic negatives, and then there are also some prints and some color materials. But of the black and white material, about 75% of it had been digitized, and therefore my job actually translated easily into the work from home environment pretty seamlessly, as long as you're prepared for it. As long as you're not like out of town on vacation when it happens, this role transitioned very seamlessly because we're in this place where we are not necessarily focused on the textual materials. They're in cool storage, they're item level catalog, they're individually housed and cleaned. We don't even really touch the materials very often. What now we're working on is metadata work. We're working on that curatorial scholarship work. And that can be done from a computer from anywhere. So as long as I got my research files, I was able to just transition from home. And our work hasn't actually missed any steps. The only thing that we're not doing right now in the archive is tours. And that's because the museum was closed for 3 months, you know. No one is doing tours. And aside from that, everything has been fairly okay. I think that's the gift of digitization, especially at that itemized level.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, you've already said there's so many things I'm noting down because there's so many things I want to come back to. And it's really interesting to talk to somebody who's got expertise and experience with Photographic Archive particularly. So well, it's really, I mean, it's good to know that, you know, the transition has been smooth for you. And I think that is the case for a lot of colleagues who have been able to get to things actually that they normally wouldn't be able to get to, or at least in a focused way, because they're not, it's not the same, disruption is not the same when you're working from home perhaps as in the office. And so that sounds great. And so coming back to that question then of how you became an archives or library scholar, it's really strange. I always have to say archives libraries because there's this, seems like a disparity, and it's not really, because your master's is in library and information science, but with this focus on archives. So how did this career unfold in front of you?
I think it's also unfolded over time. I think my understanding of who I am and what I do in this work has evolved with over the years. So funny enough, when I was an undergrad, I actually started working in the archive under this just phenomenal, fantastic, absolutely brilliant woman, Stacey Williams, who's now at the University of Chicago. She's the head of their digitization lab. And she started a program in collaboration with Deidre Skaggs at the University of Kentucky called the Learning Lab. And it was essentially this kind of sideways idea that if you could recruit undergraduate students from non-traditional majors, meaning in my cohort of the Learning Lab, I was a theater design major. One of my classmates was a pre-med. We had a business student. We had like an education major. We had students from anywhere except history and English. And it was intentional. And what they decided to do is Stacey scoured the university archives and identified collections that were subject specially into what those students understood and were learning about. So for example, for myself, they assigned me to process a playbill collection from like the 1950s. And I didn't know anything about archives at the time. You know, I've used the library meticulously throughout my undergraduate career, but I'd never processed an archive before. I didn't even know what those steps included, but I do know theater, and I was very intimately aware with how Broadway and the company playbill worked.
Right.
And so they did that for each of us. They found the subject interest of the student and found a collection, and then they could teach you the archival skills.
Right.
And it helped recruit students into the field that many of us ended up going to library school.
Oh, interesting.
Even though one of my classmates was pre-med and another student was going to be a teacher and another student was going to be an engineer. But it wasn't about the archival processing, because housing, rehousing, cleaning, removing staples, you can teach someone those skills. But what we need in this field are more subject experts.
Right. And
I think it was a really brilliant way to get people interested, and it worked for me.
That is a fantastic observation, and I wonder if you see that happening in the field. So you've had that experience, and
I don't.
oh, okay.
I,
That lab sounds fabulous. We do a
oh, it
1 week.
is.
We do a 1 week version of that, and that's not enough to really get the student totally on board. They enjoy it, and then they go away and they carry on whatever they were doing.
So here's, I think, two critical things that Stacy did right. She does so many things right.
Yeah.
She's a really fantastic person. But here's two things about the Learning Lab that I think they did right. One, it was a full year job. It was a job. It was an on-campus student job in the Special Collections Library. And I don't remember exactly what it was, but I think it paid like $10 an hour or something, which, you know, on the state school campus is not the best, but it's not the worst either. Right. And you know, it could always be better. It could always be more equitable. But for an on-campus job for sophomores and juniors and a couple of seniors, it's not a bad gig. And you're working in the library, so it's also gorgeous. You're working with something that you really enjoy, and something that you're studying. In my case, theater and the history of theater and this playbill collection, which I was naturally very interested in anyway. I just happened to add on a few skills in processing. So one, it was a job. Two, it was paid fairly well.
Yeah.
And three, it required some form of scholarly output.
Right.
And Stacy was very open at the time. I'm not sure how it is now, but at the time, it had to be some form of scholarly output, your choice, as long as it got approved. And what I did is I was researching the advertising, and I was researching and trying to understand ideas around feminist practices or anti-feminist practices in playbill advertising between the 50s and 60s. And the lab helped me string together other pieces from other collections in order to help me through an inquiry, a line of inquiry, into how to structure that level of a research thought, to the point where I was actually able to present it at a conference at Harvard at the end of the year. And it was like the coolest thing I'd ever done. I'd never been to Harvard before, and it was like this really dream opportunity to take work from the very beginning and someone help you understand how to form a research question, how to break that up, how to piecemeal and find resources, how to deep dive into primary resources, because at the time I didn't realize that the majority of my undergraduate education was in secondary resources.
Right. Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. We have a summer fellowship going at the moment, and my 5 students are all working on primary sources. And for a lot of students, it's that first encounter with primary sources, they're not sure what a primary source is. And how it differs from, in fact, that's true right the way through, as you say. And that's, you know, that in itself is something that is really beneficial, I think, to rectify that experience. So that experience really sort of shaped your cross-disciplinary interests and your focus on what primary sources could yield.
Could do.
Yeah, and so you went to is it University of Pittsburgh?
I did.
Yes,
I did.
For your MLIS, and at that point you could have gone into library work specifically, or did you have to choose libraries or archives? Was there that?
To me, I personally didn't in my journey. I think. So I'll back up and say, before I started working in the Learning Lab, I was the very first introduction into a primary source I ever had was during my Fulbright, which I actually did as an undergrad at the Free Universität. And then I came back and did an undergraduate fellowship on campus that required a thesis. And that thesis was during my senior year while I was working with the Learning Lab.
Right.
So now I'm working in the library and I'm trying to complete basically a master's level thesis. And so now all of a sudden this rigor is coming about, this blending of my academic discipline and theater being blended, because that's what my thesis was in.
Yes.
Combined with the skills around how to even search collections, how to use what is a finding aid, and how to use it, all blended together. And from there, I actually went to the Smithsonian.
Right. Wow.
I took that work and applied for a fellowship at the Smithsonian. And that's where I learned how to be an archivist. So I started in the learning lab as an archivist, or as a processing intern, whatever they were called at the time. And then I went to the Smithsonian as a processing intern. And so when it came time to decide if I was going to library school and to do what, the only option that there was archives, because the library side of it hadn't been introduced to me in the same way.
Right. You've had, prior to your current role as archivist of the Teenie Photographic Archive, you worked in the library at Pittsburgh to introduce students to collections. Is that right? To introduce students to the resources, to introduce students to ways of working with materials across a wide range of subject areas. Well, how is that right? Is that what, you know?
So actually, what's interesting, so they structured on a liaison system.
Right.
And I was a liaison librarian to the theater department.
Oh, okay.
And so my primary responsibility was to be a resource and a helpmate and a steward specifically to the theater department, in both the graduate and undergraduate side. So it was a lot of in-class work with undergrads, and then dissertation assistance.
Yes, right.
With grad students.
Right.
And so when we're talking about, opening up those lines of inquiry, helping them identify sources, helping them vet one primary source and then go find another primary source to have two sides of an argument. But it was pretty much only predominantly in the theater department.
Right. It's fantastic that you get to bring in the scholarly expertise. Right, okay, so we're going back to this idea of the subject expert.
Yes.
Because for, American university libraries, which is, I suppose, kind of what I'm most familiar with, but also public libraries in America, in small towns, I think Monticello, Jefferson County, Florida.
Right.
The collections that they have they can often have surprisingly interesting, incredibly rare types of collections, obviously unique
Very
materials.
So.
And the librarians no one can be an expert in everything at all, ever. So the librarians may not know what they have, or they have a rough idea what they have, but then, they're not the subject expert. So you have views on this, I suspect.
I do.
What are those views?
So I personally, and I feel like this is like the soapbox that I am always on, and I'll only be on here very shortly, but one of my strongest feelings in the world is that public libraries in this country are one of the final battlegrounds of democratic social communities. In this country, access to libraries is pivotal and essential and unquestionable, in my opinion. And I stand on that very resolutely. As an archivist, I can personally attest to how gorgeous and vibrant their special collections are. It's true that oftentimes a lot of librarians in the public library systems, unless they work in the archive, may not know. So if you are on like the main circulation floor, you may or may not know what's kind of like upstairs,
right,
on the third floor in the special collections room. You may have an idea, but what I will say is that librarians, our profession, what I'm very proud of this profession, is that we are inherently the people who will always help you find something, even if we don't know what it is. What I have found as I've grown in this career is I'm not necessarily an archivist anymore, even though I am at heart, and I'm not necessarily a librarian either, because the Teenie Harris Archive doesn't, and it's in an art museum, so not quite a librarian, not quite an archivist, because the archive exists in an art museum, so it actually follows a very different set of rules than pretty much any other archival collection. But the pursuit of information and understanding information as a source of power, and sharing and having free access to that power for everyone, that is something that I believe in.
I believe in that too. I think that the public library in particular, for communities, and especially communities where members of this community don't otherwise have access to computers or sort of regular supply of books, they're clearly critical and under threat in most countries that I can think of right now, especially one of the first things to get hit. So information as a source of power, I think, is obviously is really, really critical. And so in your work with the Teenie Harris Archive, how are you using the information that archive contains? How do you seek to bring its power to the community at large?
So one of the cool things about the Teenie Harris collection is that the collection itself doesn't need my help. And once I realized that a few years ago, it unlocked so much for me. The African-American community in Pittsburgh, what's really unique about it, and there's all kinds of references to it, from anything about the Hill District, books like Smoketown, books like The Warmth of Other Suns. There's all these nuances and touch points with Pittsburgh. The African-American community here has always known who they are and what they have. They've always known how special they are. The jazz clubs here, the history here, the church groups here, the sororities and fraternities here. Pittsburgh's always known that the community here was ripe and vibrant and special. Teenie Harris knew that and photographed it. And then, life got bigger and smaller out the same way. The internet and then not the internet, and press and not press, and there's so many moving parts that oftentimes the fabric and the stories of the community here can get shuffled under a little bit. But that doesn't mean it's not there, and it doesn't mean that they don't know it or don't remember it. And the Teenie Harris Archive, and my role as the archivist for it, is really just to be like, here, it's your archive. It's your archive. Like, I don't do anything to it or with it. I mean, we make sure that, but that's it. As long as it's safe and preserved and the emulsion layers are not melting away, that's my only job. And it's really cool because however we can increase access with an understanding of how our users want to search the collection, and not necessarily how the archive world has created ideas around taxonomy or standardization. One of the coolest parts about my job is a few years ago when I just decided to not do that anymore, which was really awesome. We just let it go. It was, I don't know what permissions anybody needs for that, but being in an art museum means that we don't have to follow the same rules as maybe university libraries and archives. I don't report to another librarian or archivist. I report to a curator and a director of a museum. And therefore, I can advocate for what's best for the community, irrespective of what the rest of the field would like to do around standardization. I can say, okay, hey, this community uses these terms and have been using these terms since the steel mills. They've been talking about the jazz clubs in this way, using this language, and this is how we're finding that they search the collection and are coming up short on the results. So let's tweak the back end of our search engine so that it gives them the results that we know that they're looking for, because they're calling or emailing the archive and putting in reference requests when the website doesn't give them the results that they're looking for. But why don't we just change the search engine?
Fantastic. See, that's fantastic. So I've recently been working with various repositories. I'm not going to name them. Big statewide online repositories. Obviously, online being so important right now. So we're going to come to that in just a minute.
Sure.
And what you put into the search engine, the things that you get back are sort of unrelated, but also increase the marginalization of particular kinds of voices, because they are subsumed within a really unthinking set of kind of descriptors or classifiers. So let's sort of jump straight into this. So I think what you've just said is really fabulous, really actually paradigm setting, right? The accessibility through search functionality, I think is really significant. So clearly the digital plays a large role in all of our lives at the minute, but so you're very alert to the digital environment in terms of accessibility and also the collection more broadly. And what role does the digital therefore sort of play in your day-to-day job? Or how important do you think both digitization and its accessibility is right now or is likely to become? That's 3 questions in one. Pick whatever you like.
Okay. So access to the Teenie Harris collection would not be possible without digitization. With the understanding, before anyone in the archive field calls me out on this, without digitization is not a sole take point for preservation. It is a tool as a part of a larger preservation agenda or plan.
Right.
Just as a blanket statement to make sure that no one in the archives field says anything else. However, because the collection is Miss Mary Sue sitting on her front porch and her granddaughter is just trying to find a photo of her for her 75th birthday, we got to make that easy. Because in my community and this community here in Pittsburgh, the digital literacy and the digital divide can often be so big that it can be insurmountable for those who just want to, they know their own history and they just want to participate in it. Yeah. So you have the majority of our reference requests, for example, are, my mom is having her 90th birthday, or my parents are having their 40th wedding anniversary, or, I know that my mom was the first African-American woman to be in the math department at the University of Pittsburgh, things like that. And people just want to find photos of their own family members. We do get so many wonderful requests for scholars writing books, or for grad students looking to incorporate this work into dissertations. We get a lot of requests from like films and TV shows, but the heart and the core of what we do is Miss Mary Sue. And if she can't find a photo from 1945, then I'm not doing my job right. And keeping all of our digitization efforts focused on Miss Mary Sue, that drives everything. And so as we look at metadata work, well, is it in a way that so-and-so's granddaughter can find it? If not, then try again. When we think about what gets digitized first and second and third, and how we find, and if we're going to do this last and how we do it, all of those things are determined on whether or not someone on Wiley Avenue can find the photo. Everything in our digital efforts, everything in our website and the new website that we were able to develop last year, it's all based on, can the granddaughter of the pastor of such and such church find a photo of that church from 1945? That's kind of it for us.
So actually, and I have a question that is about the sort of deluge of the digital dump, the proliferation of digital images, digital tools, which, Arlette Farge in The Allure of the Archive talks about the abundance of the archive, but the overabundance of what's available digitally, even though it's only a tiny percentage of the world's potential kind of textual or artistic record, is overwhelming for many. And what's really interesting in what you're saying is that you are so conscious to provide vast amounts of data on the one hand and never forget the human being on the other.
That's exactly it.
To tailor it, that focus just seems so coherent when you say it, so obvious and so coherent, and it just isn't how the majority of, I think, archives, and I suppose it's partly because a lot of archives and libraries have like the British Library has three, maybe more, separate catalogues that have emerged in the last sort of 30 years, 3 digital catalogues, and they don't kind of cross over. So where you land is really serendipitous, but also potentially profoundly unhelpful. So this idea of cogency and focus in your mind, who your audience is, just strikes me as very significant. And then, so in what way then, as a clear thinking, digitally astute archivist, how do you see the profession unfolding in the next, maybe let's say decade? I mean, who knows, right? Frankly, but what do you anticipate?
Well, I think the one thing I've learned in this pandemic is to never anticipate anything, because everything that we had strategically planned that we would do as a department for 2020 is like completely out the window. I was joking recently that the most ridiculous purchase I made this year was a 2020 planner. It was
just the word planner.
Yes, you know, but for the profession, I have a hope, I have an idea, I have a dream for this profession that I don't see myself necessarily as an archivist much anymore, because as I said before, I really value the power of information and of helping people find things. And I would hope and pray that as the profession moves forward, if we focus more on people than things, whatever that looks like, I think will take us in the right direction. That gets everyone just a little bit closer to the sun, because it's not necessarily about this particular manuscript collection, and it's not necessarily about the tangible or intangible value of the content of that collection, but who is its primary user and audience, and how is that collection needed? And whose collections haven't been kept or created or curated or taken into archives, at least over the past 50 years or so, and really taking an intent focus in broadening our profession, broadening our collections over the next couple of years. And as we develop, and I do believe, and I've seen great strides in this, but as we're talking about metadata practices, and as we're talking about access and discoverability and searchability, the end user is so important. It's paramount to think about what problem are we solving for our users. We're stewards. As a profession, we're a more heart profession. I think there's the mind, there's the heart, and there's the being, and I think it all works in together. But we're a heart profession. We're here to serve. But if all of our stuff just stays in dusty boxes in somebody's like climate controlled lab, it doesn't serve anything. And it was one of my very early frustrations with the field when I was probably about 5 or 6 years ago, when I was at the University of Pittsburgh, and we're just we take collections out of storage, we process them, we make a finding aid, and then we put them back in storage. And I was seeing this at a lot of institutions, and I'm seeing a lot of it now. And it's not that anyone's right or anyone's wrong, but where's the use? Where's the usability? Where's the discoverability? We make a lot of collections accessible, and then they don't get used. I want us to really think, what problem are we solving, and work from there? How do we make the world a better place, and work from there? If we just focus on individual people, and how we make people, or how we help people find what they need, whether it's genealogy, whether it is articles about who knows what from a researcher or a conductor from who knows where, it doesn't matter. The question is how do we solve a problem, rather than processing because we've always done it that way? And maybe that's a little too controversial, and maybe it isn't, I don't know, but I don't necessarily believe in processing for the sake of processing because we have backlogs. I believe in making the making, with the information that we have, collections accessible and available that solve problems.
And that kind of comes right back to what you said about information as a source of power, because that word power, I think in itself is easily misunderstood in this context. There is that power of the collective state-sponsored memory, right? Who gets the memorial? Who gets the flashy kind of archive? Whose collections do the kind of really rich institutions go after? A lot of it tends to be, you know, there's a little bit of celebrification and so on. That's the one form of power. This other form of power, again, to do with collective memory, but perhaps more at the community level, is the power that somebody gets when they find the thing that they were looking for, is the sense of belonging that they get when they find their grandma's photograph, or they see that their great uncle did this, right? You know, and he was noticed, and it was recorded, and it exists. They exist. This idea of
that's it,
right?
That is it. I think, I feel, I believe deep down, every one of us just wants to know and believe and feel seen. We want to feel heard. We want to feel understood. And we want to know that where we come from has been seen, has been heard, has been understood. That's where archives lives.
Right. And there's such a lot, I mean, there's such a lot of work to do in that regard. And we were chatting just before we started recording, and you were saying that in the last couple of years, you've seen a real kind of uptick, is that a word? Uptick in terms of the recognition of the need to provide this kind of, you know, we can think of it, as you say, as a service, but to make sure that voices are heard, that multiple voices are heard, and actually to focus our energy for some time on broadening the diversity and the representation of our collections, to make sure that the histories are preserved and voices are conserved and made discoverable. What is it, do you think, that might be generating that more positive move to the right, justified sort of broadening of the work that we do?
I think that these stories, these communities have always been here and been around, and I know we talked about that briefly, and I can assure you that that is absolutely the case here in Pittsburgh. I think that the world is getting a lot bigger and a lot smaller, and I think that diversity and inclusion isn't necessary. I think people are starting to recognize that it's not a task, it's not a checkbox, it's not something that you do. The world will become more inclusive as a strength, as a superpower. And that's not anything to be afraid of. It's nothing to shy from. It's something truly wonderful to embrace. And I think that all of our GLAM institutions are realizing that and recognizing that and reckoning with that. I definitely would say that there are always institutions that are maybe a little more historic, for whom their collections are deep and they are vast, and turning a big ship is hard and it takes time, but I promise you it's worth it.
That's fabulously uplifting, and I think you know, this sense of the job that you do, that all colleagues who work with primary sources do, is, I feel, in itself an uplifting job. But you know, I haven't practiced at all. I've just been working in departments. What's the most enjoyable part of your job? It's my last question, really. What's the most enjoyable part of your job? It's just the way you talk about it just makes me think it must all be enjoyable, and I know for a fact that's not going to be true. But what is the most enjoyable part of your job?
Easily when the most enjoyable part of my, so I have two answers, because it has changed honestly in the past, I'd say, year. Prior to, maybe let's say, just as a cutoff date, January 1st of 2020. Prior to January 1st of 2020, the most enjoyable part of my job was when someone like screams in the gallery. First off, I love when places that are historically very quiet institutions like libraries and museums, and people are having like the time of their life. It's like my favorite thing ever. And I love, there's a moment when someone finds something and they go, right. Oh my God, that's my dad. And then everyone runs over to them and they're like, whoa. And then this person is like, yeah, my dad, he was in World War II, and we used to live in this house in the Hill District, and I remember this, and we had this doll shop. And then you see people light up and come alive when they find something that means something to them, whether it's the school they went to, or even I have found that for communities who aren't here in Pittsburgh, there are so many things in the Teenie Harris collection that resonate with other Black communities all over the country, whether it be, in Chicago, we had this car too, or, I grew up in South Carolina and we had these kinds of crossing guard uniforms too. I remember this, or my mom used to tell me about this tea set. When the community starts talking to each other, and everyone gets so excited and they get really loud. Maybe that's my millennialism coming out, but I love when people get very loud and animated over history. It is just the greatest thing ever. And maybe that's also the small nerd in me, but I love it when people start talking to each other. Mm. Now, I'll say that with the caveat of my new favorite thing about my job is this idea that I am striving to create a situation or to create a world. And I don't think it exists yet, but I believe that my goal is to create a world where that situation, that excitement, that buzz happens without me.
Right.
And not to put myself or this role out of business. That's not what it's about. It's about the ability to create a system that is so sophisticatedly and intrinsically understood. It sees people, it hears people, that it can help communities find each other without assistance, without the need of not necessarily the archivist, but so much of the collection is hidden. In my knowledge of the collection, if someone says, I remember they went to Shelley High School and they used to have this thing, I can take that knowledge into the database behind the scenes and help them find what they need. And I love doing that because I love the aha moment that comes from that when someone finds what they need. But what if we imagined a world where people could find what they need easily and seamlessly and more efficiently and faster and with less headache, and they could have those loud aha moments in a gallery and there's no archivist there? Because the system is so intuitive and it understands the human need so well that it can serve people without being handheld or hindered by an archivist. For me, I'm like, what if we could create a situation where that aha moment happens between people on their own? What if? I don't know, but what if?
Okay, so I said that was the last question, and clearly I fibbed, because that, I mean, okay, so what you're talking about, what I'm hearing is this like a level of transparency, and a clarity about systems and structures that allow for no overt mediation, right? Mm-hmm. So people discover on their own. And in fact, to get to that stage, we require far more mediation behind the scenes. So there need to be more archivists, more people working to make this material discoverable, and then sort of stepping back to create systems that allow anyone a really rapid, open access. And that sounds to me like a moment at which you would bring in computational tools and methods, artificial intelligence, varying kinds of machine learning techniques, to provide that kind of user experience. But at the level of the sort of front end, right, with all of the archival stuff that has to go. So that's a vision, Dominique. That's a vision.
And it's something that we're starting. We were very, very fortunate. We had some of the greatest partners ever with the Collections as Data Part to Whole grant. We had the opportunity to build some software that got installed in our galleries. It was so heartbreaking. We worked so hard to build some software that could be installed in our galleries to start the very first baby step of this vision. And we opened it, and it was so exciting, and people were using it and people were loving it. And then March 15th, the museum closed 5 weeks after we opened it. And it was heartbreaking because we had spent the last couple of years listening to our audiences and doing so much research on how they research, who's researching, how do they come to a successful conclusion. And we really listened. We just stopped for a couple of years and just listened. And we were able to build something that we hoped was at least a first start at this. And it does use some levels around machine learning and other more technical libraries. But then it closed after 5 weeks, and it was so heartbreaking. But one day.
Well, and this period of hiatus that we're all undergoing to some or other kind of extent, it has allowed for reflection and for a sense of reprioritization, or at least an alertness to the things that we were doing that were really good, and it's such a shame we've had to put them on hold. So you get that sense of where your efforts might lie when we're all able to return to whatever the new normal is. I think the energy that you bring intellectually and professionally, and just in terms of the way that you regard your collections and your communities, is just really, it's profoundly inspiring. It really is. It's profoundly inspiring. And I know that people really love to hear what you're saying here. And as I say, I would urge everybody to spend a very rewarding 10 minutes watching your TED talk, and I hope that we'll see you do another one on what we've just been talking about now. I love this idea of the disappearing archivist, because it's actually, the results of it would be more archivists just not visibly mediating, and I think that's a fantastic, and librarians, that's a fantastic kind of vision for the future. So Dominique, I want to thank you very much for doing this, and to say that I hope that we meet in person before too long.
Absolutely. Thank you so very, very much.
Thank you.